So today we have a special treat. I have a special treat because I don't get to preach. I get to worship and listen. Um, our our conference minister, Reverend Tyler Connoley, is here to give the message today. I have appreciated Tyler so very, very much. And in case you weren't here 2 years ago when Tyler and I had a conversation up here, I'm going to give a quick little spiel about some of my gratitude for Tyler. So I was associate pastor at Cedar Hills and wrapping up my time there when Tyler came into the conference. And then I went over to a Christian church, Disciples of Christ, and was the pastor over there. So I was a pastor at a church that wasn't in our denomination. And I had some hard moments. It was also during COVID. You can imagine what maybe some of those hard moments were like and were about. And Tyler still made time for me. Tyler would still go on walks with me and help me figure out how do I show up in this moment? How do I lead in this moment? How do I walk alongside a congregation and still show up with my family in the midst of a world beset by the plague? So, Tyler, I appreciate that you still make time for me. I appreciate your steadfast presence in our conference very much. Would you like to come up here and give a word? Okay.
So yes, for those of you who don't know me, I am the Reverend Tyler Connoley. I'm the conference minister for the Central Pacific Conference of the United Church of Christ. The Central Pacific Conference is all of the United Churches of Christ in Oregon, and 2 churches in southern Washington, and 7 churches in southern Idaho. And so we are actually the Central Pacific Conference together. And one of the things that I like to do when I go to a church is to just say thank you. Thank you for being the church for this time and for this place. Thank you for loving our neighbors here in Parkrose. Thank you for being the church that God needs for this neighborhood, for this time. You see, we have First Church in Boise where we're going to have our annual gathering, and they love their neighbors there. And we have a church in Eugene who loves our neighbors there. And we have one in Medford who loves our neighbors there. But we need you to love our neighbors here. Because, see, I don't believe that any of us can love the whole world. But I do believe that if all of us love the people who are close to us, then together we can love the whole world. So thank you. Thank you for being the church for this time and for this place. With that aside, let's pray. Spirit of love, Spirit of wisdom, as I speak today, I pray that you will guide my words. Help me to say what it is that you would have me to say. Help us to hear what we need to hear. God, even if what I say is not exactly what we hear, I know that you have the power to translate my words into our hearts. And I ask you to do that today. In your holy name we pray. Amen. So I actually want to start by letting you talk for a minute. I've been thinking a lot about the things that Jesus did. And maybe there are some stories of things that Jesus did that matter to you. I'm not talking about the things that he said. The Lord's Prayer is very beautiful. The Sermon on the Mount is lovely. There are lots of great parables. But also, one of the amazing things about the Gospels that we received is that they weren't just a collection of sayings. The Gospels that the church decided were the ones that would be included in the Bible were Gospels that included the things that Jesus did. so that the sayings were part of the story of his life. And so I invite you to just think about what are some of the things that Jesus did, some of his doings, not some of his sayings that matter to you. And I'd like you to just turn to the person next to you and share with the person next to you. What's a story of something that Jesus did? Take a moment to do that. So what was something that you said? Just like shout out just a brief like reminder of a story. Go ahead. He loved and protected the people around him. Anybody, not special people, but anybody around him. Yeah, he embraced everybody. In fact, like he got in trouble because of the people that he ate with, right? There were people who were like, "Do you realize who he hangs out with?" He forgave, and he welcomed anyone, no matter what their race. Although I'm going to challenge that a little bit in one of the stories I tell today. No, one more. Kindness. He was remembered, he practiced kindness and was remembered for his kindness. Yeah. So, I don't know about you, but lately it has been really hard to be a Christian for me. With the rise of white Christian nationalism, with the way that Christianity has been co-opted by members of our government, and there have been times when I just sometimes just think, I can't do this anymore. If that's what Christianity is like, I don't want to be a part of it. And so last year, I was spending a lot of time realizing that I needed to go back to Jesus, that I needed to go back to the values that really matter to me, that if I could just ground myself in what it was about Christianity that brought me to Christianity, that brought me back to Christianity, I will say, that would help me to sort of be a Christian again at a time when it was really hard to be a Christian. And at the same time, I was reading this book called Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview by Randy Woodley. And in this book, Randy Woodley talks about the fact that in indigenous theologies, the story is what matters. And the story is told, and often that's just it. You tell the story. And the story is what matters. In Western theologies, often it's about doctrine and orthodoxy. And you start with the idea, and then you might add a story in to sort of illustrate. But he says in indigenous theologies, it's the story that matters. He invites us to tell stories and not try to explain them. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to practice that. I'm going to tell you some stories of Jesus that matter to me, some of the things that he did not things that he said. And I'm not going to theologize. At the end, I'll have an invitation, but I'm not going to explain the stories. I'm not going to make sure that they have a point. I'm just going to tell you some stories. So the first story that I want to tell you is that there was a day when Jesus said to his disciples, let's get in the boat and go to the other side of the lake. And, Jesus' disciples, they knew boats, and they knew weather, and they probably saw the clouds, but they got in the boat. And they started to go out on the Sea of Galilee, and a storm started to rage. And the winds were rising, and the clouds and the rain, and it seemed like they were going to die, and Jesus was nowhere to be found. And they were rowing as fast as they could, and Jesus was not helping to row. And the winds were coming up, and there came a point where they were like, we're going to die. Jesus, do you even care? And where was Jesus? He was asleep. The fact was, he had been there all the time. They just hadn't bothered to pick him up and say, Jesus, can you help us? And so they woke him up, and he stood up, and he said words of peace, and the winds died down. And then we're told they were terrified. And they said, what kind of person is this? There was another time when Jesus was walking, and there was a woman that we're told was Syrophoenician. She was Greek speaking from another part of the world, and she was also a Canaanite. And Jews hated Canaanites. They had spent hundreds of years teaching themselves and their children to hate Canaanites. And so Jesus was walking, and this Canaanite woman was following him, and she was shouting at him. She was saying, Jesus, my daughter has a demon. You have to help her. And Jesus said nothing. And his disciples came to him, and they said, can you do something about that woman? She is bothering us. And Jesus turned to them and he said, I came for the lost sheep of Israel. Well, this woman had dealt with prejudice. She probably had dealt with religious leaders before. And so what did she do? She went and fell down in front of him, where he couldn't ignore her anymore. And she said, Lord, have mercy on me. And Jesus said, it's not right for the children, for the dogs, to get what the children are meant to have. But you know what? She had dealt with prejudice probably her whole life. She was a Syrophoenician from somewhere else, living among Jews who hated Canaanites. And so she smiled at him. And she said, yes, but even the dogs get the crumbs off the table. And Jesus said, You are a woman of great faith. What you want has been granted. And her child was healed at that moment. That's a really hard story. And you might wonder, like, Tyler, how could that be one of your favorite stories about Jesus? I can tell you, it's one of my favorite stories about Jesus because it was told to me by the Reverend Tracy Blackman. Tracy Blackman is a black woman who preaches. That's how she describes herself. And she has a sermon called I Am the Syrophoenician Woman. And she is able to tell that story in a way similar to how I told it today, that helps us listen to it more carefully. You know, for a very, very long time in Western Christianity, only certain people were allowed to tell stories. Only European men were allowed to tell stories. And then eventually, about 150 years ago, 200 years ago, men of African descent were allowed to tell stories, but only to certain people. And it's really only been in about the last 150 years that women were allowed to tell the stories of Jesus in public spaces in Christianity. And that story matters to me because Reverend Tracy Blackman told it. It's only in the last 50 years that queer people have been allowed to tell stories of Jesus in spaces like this, wearing stoles. So the last two stories that I want to tell you are stories that matter to me because I'm a queer person. These are probably my two favorite stories of Jesus. And I'm going to get a tissue first. Oh, perfect. Thank you. So another time, Jesus was walking with his disciples and with other people around him. And again, another person came and fell down in front of Jesus, wanting help. This person was a centurion, one of the soldiers who was oppressing the people in this region. In fact, a commander of the people who were oppressing the people in this region. It's like an ICE agent came and fell down in front of Jesus. And he said, "Lord, my pais is sick unto death. Will you heal him?" Now, pais is a Greek word that has three possible meanings. One of the meanings is son. A pais could be your son. Another meaning of pais is slave, someone that you purchased as an enslaver, an enslaved person. The third possible meaning of pais is an enslaved person who was bought to be a lover, a male lover of the person who bought them. Now, this is repugnant practice, and we don't abide by such things today. But I also want to say that this was a time when women were the property of their husbands. And so if you were going to have a spouse, you purchased them. And if they were male and you were male, they were called a pais. I believe, and we can talk later about why, or you can just Google it. Google the story of the centurion. I believe that this person was the centurion's lover. I think there's good evidence for that. And I think that everybody in the story, everyone around Jesus knew that this Pais was this man's lover. And so you can imagine that Jesus said, well, we need to talk about Leviticus chapter 19. Because I don't know if I can come and heal him. What kind of Pais is this? Is this your son? That's not what Jesus did. Jesus said, okay, let me come and heal him. And then the centurion said, oh, no, I'm not worthy for you to be in my house. But I know that you can just say the word and he'll be healed. And Jesus turned to the people around him and he said, I have never seen faith like this in any of the children of Israel. He said, your Pais is healed. And we're told that at that moment, his Pais was healed and those two men were able to be in relationship again. Jesus healed that relationship and allowed them to live on together in love. One more story. It's a short one. It was almost time for the Passover. And Jesus needed somewhere to have the Passover. And so he said to John and Peter, go and prepare some place for us to have the Passover. And they said, where? They were homeless. And he said, oh, go down to the city square, find a man carrying water, follow him. Wherever he lives, there's a place for us. So they went down to the city square and they found the man carrying water. They followed him, and sure enough, they found the place and there was a room and it was already prepared. That's the story. Isn't that amazing? That is my favorite story of Jesus. Makes me cry. And you're like, okay. Good story, sure. Well, maybe you, like me, did not grow up in the village. I grew up in Zambia, Africa. And so I know some things that you might not know to explain some things about this story. Have you ever wondered, how did they know which one to follow? I mean, there are lots of men. How did they know? Men don't carry water. That's what you know if you grew up in the village. Carrying water is women's work. It was as if Jesus said, go downtown Portland on the waterfront, find the man wearing a dress, follow him. Wherever he lives, that's where we can have our meal. So in the middle of this story of the Last Supper, of the Passover, there's this genderqueer person who makes the whole thing possible, who has a place for Jesus. And we don't know anything about this person. Maybe they lived in a house where all the women had died. And there just wasn't anybody who could carry water. I like to think that this person was somebody like me. Someone who was assigned male at birth, but who likes girly things. Like painting my fingernails. Peterson Toscano, in his one-person play called Transfigurations, imagines that this person was assigned female at birth and had come out as male and was binding themselves and dressing in men's clothes, but was still expected by their family to carry water. We don't know. What we do know is that the Last Supper was possible because of this man who carried water. And what I know is that every time I come to the table and serve communion, and I say, "Come, for all things are ready," I'm remembering that the first time someone said, "Come, for all things are ready," was a man who carried water. I said I would tell you some stories and then make an invitation. And so here's my invitation. We each have stories of Jesus. Maybe it's the sweetness of the chocolate Jesus. But we each have stories of Jesus. And we need to hear stories of Jesus. And we need to tell each other stories of Jesus. And so my invitation to you is that whatever stories of Jesus matter to you, tell those stories from your place, from who you are, because we need to hear more stories of Jesus. Amen.